the truth no one wants you to hear. If this information were truly harmless, it would be discussed openly everywhere, yet the truth is quietly buried, not because it is wrong, but because healthy seniors do not generate profit for an industry built around long-term treatment, prescriptions, and repeat patients. After years of observing hospitals, clinics, and long waiting rooms, I have watched the same scene play out again and again, families sitting in silence, staring at the floor, trying to understand how someone who was fine only months ago suddenly became a permanent patient. What most of them never realize is that the damage did not start recently, and it did not start with age. We are taught to believe that decline is unavoidable, that weakness, memory loss, and chronic illness are simply the price we pay for living longer, yet this narrative is far more convenient than it is truthful. Aging itself is not the enemy, but the accumulation of small, repeated stresses placed on the body every single day eventually overwhelms even the strongest systems. What makes this especially disturbing is that many of these stresses come from habits people trust the most. They come from foods labeled as healthy, routines praised as responsible, and advice repeated so often that no one thinks to question it anymore. Over time, these choices quietly strain blood vessels, disrupt metabolic balance, and create conditions where serious events can occur without warning. I have seen individuals who exercised regularly, avoided obvious junk food, and followed standard health advice still suffer devastating outcomes, while the real causes were dismissed as bad luck or genetics. Blaming fate is easier than admitting that widely accepted guidance may be incomplete or outdated. This is not about fear, and it is not about blaming anyone. It is about understanding that the body remembers everything we do to it, even when symptoms are absent. By the time pain or dysfunction appears, the process has often been unfolding for years beneath the surface. If you are listening to this, especially if you are over 40 or caring for someone who is, what comes next is not meant to alarm you, but to give you the awareness most people only gain after irreversible damage has already occurred. And this is where the story truly begins. Aging is not the disease. For decades, aging has been framed as an unavoidable decline, a slow and irreversible breakdown of the body that no one can escape, yet this belief is one of the most damaging misconceptions ever normalized. Age, by itself, does not suddenly weaken blood vessels, destroy memory, or trigger chronic disease, but repeated stress placed on the body over time absolutely does. The human body is designed to adapt, repair, and recover even well into later decades of life, but adaptation has limits. When those limits are crossed day after day, year after year, the damage becomes permanent, not because the body failed, but because it was never given the conditions it needed to maintain itself. What most people don't realize is that many so-called age-related conditions often appear in populations decades earlier when exposed to the same environmental and dietary pressures. This alone should raise an uncomfortable question: if aging were truly the cause, why does the timeline change so dramatically depending on lifestyle and environment? Instead of addressing this, society lowers expectations. Fatigue becomes normal. Brain fog becomes normal. Medication lists grow longer, and the absence of symptoms becomes the definition of health, rather than actual function and resilience. This shift allows gradual decline to pass unnoticed until a critical event finally forces attention. I have seen individuals in their 70s with stronger cardiovascular markers than people in their 40s, not because they were lucky, but because their daily habits reduced stress on the body rather than adding to it. Meanwhile, others experienced accelerated decline simply because they trusted that doing what everyone else was doing must be safe. The danger lies in mistaking familiarity for safety. Just because a habit is common does not mean it is harmless, and just because damage accumulates slowly does not mean it is insignificant. Aging only reveals what has been building quietly beneath the surface. Understanding this is uncomfortable, because it removes the illusion that decline is inevitable, and with that illusion gone, responsibility quietly returns to daily choices. That realization can feel heavy, but it is also where real control begins. Because if aging is not the disease, then the real question becomes this: what have we been feeding the process all along? And that is what we need to examine next. The healthy advice that backfires. Most people believe that danger comes from obvious excess, from clearly unhealthy choices that are easy to point at and easy to avoid, yet in reality some of the most damaging habits are hidden behind labels like balanced, recommended, and good for you. This is where the real problem begins. Health advice is often designed to work for the largest possible population, not for aging bodies with changing metabolism, slower detoxification, and more sensitive blood vessels. What works reasonably well at 30 does not behave the same way at 50 or 60, yet the advice rarely changes, and the warnings almost never follow. Over time, well-meaning routines become rigid habits. People eat the same foods every day, prepared the same way, at the same times, trusting that consistency equals discipline and discipline equals health. What they don't see is how repetition amplifies small stresses, especially when the body's ability to recover has already begun to slow. I have watched patients defend their habits with confidence, listing every healthy choice they made, unable to understand why their test results told a different story. The idea that something recommended could quietly work against them felt impossible, almost insulting. And yet, the patterns were impossible to ignore. The problem is not that the advice was malicious, but that it was incomplete. It failed to account for context, for individual variation, and for the simple truth that the body is not static across decades. Without that context, guidance becomes oversimplified, and oversimplification always carries a cost. What makes this even more dangerous is that the effects do not show up immediately. There is no instant pain, no sudden warning, no clear cause and effect moment. Instead, changes occur slowly in the background, altering inflammation levels, blood chemistry, and vascular flexibility until one day the margin for error disappears. This is why so many people are caught off guard. They were not reckless. They were obedient. And obedience, when paired with outdated or generalized advice, can be just as risky as neglect. If this feels unsettling, it should. Because once you accept that some healthy advice can backfire under the wrong conditions, the next question becomes unavoidable. Which specific habits deserve a closer look? That is where we are headed next. The vegetable nobody warned you about. There is a reason this topic is rarely discussed in detail, and it has nothing to do with lack of evidence. The issue is discomfort. Questioning foods that have been praised for decades feels almost taboo, especially when those foods are associated with health, discipline, and doing the right thing. One particular vegetable appears on plates around the world every single day. It is recommended in hospitals, included in meal plans, and promoted as a cornerstone of a healthy diet. For most people, it seems harmless, even beneficial. But under certain conditions, especially as the body ages, its effects can change in ways few expect. The problem is not the vegetable itself, but how it interacts with an aging system. As metabolic efficiency declines, the body processes certain compounds more slowly, allowing them to linger longer in the bloodstream. Over time, this can contribute to low-grade inflammation and increased stress on blood vessel walls, particularly in individuals who consume the same foods repeatedly without variation. What makes this especially dangerous is how invisible the process is. There is no immediate discomfort, no clear signal to stop. Blood pressure may appear normal. Energy levels may feel acceptable. Meanwhile, subtle changes are taking place beneath the surface, gradually narrowing margins of safety. I have seen individuals consume this food daily for years, believing they were protecting their health, unaware that preparation methods, portion size, and frequency all played a role in how their bodies responded. In younger years, the system compensated easily. Later in life, that compensation quietly failed. This is not about eliminating foods or creating fear around eating. It is about understanding that context matters more than labels. A food can be beneficial in one situation and problematic in another, depending on age, frequency, and individual physiology. Ignoring this reality does not make it disappear. It simply delays the moment when the body can no longer adapt. And that is why the next question matters far more than what this vegetable is. It is why the damage happens without warning. Why the damage happens silently. One of the most dangerous misconceptions about health is the belief that serious problems always announce themselves clearly and early, when in reality the body is designed to hide trouble for as long as possible. Silence is not safety, it is compensation. The human body constantly adjusts to stress. Blood vessels stretch, organs work harder, and systems reroute resources to maintain balance. This ability is remarkable, but it comes with a hidden cost. Each adjustment reduces the margin of resilience, making the system more fragile even as it appears stable from the outside. This is why routine checkups often fail to tell the full story. Numbers may sit just inside acceptable ranges, and symptoms may be absent altogether, creating the illusion that everything is under control. Meanwhile, structural and biochemical changes continue quietly, unnoticed, and unaddressed. The brain and cardiovascular system are particularly good at masking early dysfunction. Blood flow adapts. Pressure redistributes. Inflammation remains low-grade and persistent rather than acute and obvious. By the time symptoms appear, the damage is rarely new. It is simply no longer avoidable. This silent progression is why so many events feel sudden. A stroke appears to come out of nowhere. Cognitive decline seems abrupt. In reality, these outcomes are the final chapter of a much longer process that unfolded gradually, without drama, without pain, and without interruption. What makes this especially unsettling is that people often interpret the absence of discomfort as proof that their habits are safe. Feeling fine becomes reassurance, even though the body may be working overtime to maintain that feeling. The harder it works, the less reserve remains. The body does not issue warnings the way machines do. There is no alarm light for long-term vascular stress or cumulative metabolic strain. Instead, it adapts quietly, until adaptation is no longer possible. Understanding this changes how health should be evaluated. The goal is not just to feel normal today, but to preserve the system's ability to adapt tomorrow. Because when silence finally breaks, it rarely does so gently. And once it does, there is no rewind. Who is most at risk? It would be comforting to believe that risk is highest among those who ignore their health, make reckless choices, and live without structure, but reality is far less reassuring. In many cases, the individuals most vulnerable to silent damage are the ones who believe they are doing everything right. Discipline creates patterns, and patterns create predictability. Eating the same foods, following the same routines, and trusting the same advice day after day feels safe, responsible, and controlled. Yet the body does not respond to repetition the way schedules do. Biological systems thrive on variation, not rigidity. As the body ages, its ability to process, neutralize, and recover from certain stressors changes. What once passed through easily may now linger longer, interact differently, and place more strain on blood vessels and metabolic pathways. When exposure is repeated daily, even mild stress becomes cumulative. This is why some of the most health-conscious individuals are caught completely off guard. They exercise, avoid obvious excess, and follow guidelines faithfully, yet their bodies quietly accumulate damage because the guidance they follow was never adjusted for age, frequency, or individual response. There's also a psychological component that deepens the risk. People who identify as disciplined are less likely to question routines that have become part of their identity. Changing them feels like admitting failure, even when evidence suggests adaptation is necessary. Meanwhile, those with more flexible habits often introduce natural variation without realizing it. They eat different foods, skip routines, and unknowingly give their bodies recovery windows that rigid schedules never allow. Risk, then, is not always about how extreme a habit is, but how unchanging it becomes. Consistency without context can quietly work against the very goal it was meant to support. Recognizing this does not mean abandoning discipline. It means evolving it. Because the body changes, whether we acknowledge it or not. And the consequences of ignoring that change do not care how good our intentions were. What doctors rarely say out loud. Most medical conversations are shaped not only by knowledge, but by time, protocols, and unspoken boundaries. Appointments are short. Guidelines are standardized. And anything that sits outside widely accepted recommendations is often avoided, not because it lacks value, but because it invites uncomfortable questions. Doctors are trained to treat what can be measured clearly and addressed efficiently. Symptoms, lab values, and acute events fit neatly into that structure. Slow, cumulative damage caused by everyday habits does not. It unfolds over years, crosses multiple systems, and resists simple explanations, making it difficult to address in a 10-minute consultation. There's also the issue of liability and consensus. Suggesting that commonly recommended foods or routines may behave differently in aging bodies can sound controversial, even when observations support it. Without absolute consensus, silence often feels safer than nuance. As a result, many professionals focus on managing outcomes rather than questioning inputs. Blood pressure is controlled. Cholesterol is lowered. Symptoms are reduced. But the underlying patterns that contributed to the problem remain largely untouched, quietly continuing in the background. This does not mean doctors are indifferent or unaware. Many see the patterns clearly. They notice the similarities among patients who arrive with the same conditions, despite different lifestyles on the surface. Yet breaking from standardized advice requires time, explanation, and a willingness to challenge deeply ingrained beliefs. Patients, too, play a role in this silence. Many come seeking confirmation, not exploration. They want reassurance that what they are already doing is correct. Challenging that expectation can create resistance, frustration, or distrust, which further discourages deeper conversations. So the system settles into a familiar rhythm. Treatment replaces prevention. Management replaces understanding. And the space where meaningful adjustments could occur remains largely unexplored. This silence is not a conspiracy. It is a byproduct of efficiency, structure, and discomfort with uncertainty. But its consequences are real. Because what goes unexamined continues unchanged. And what continues unchanged continues to shape outcomes. Which brings us to the next question: if awareness exists, what can actually be done about it? That is where the conversation finally becomes practical. Small changes, massive impact. When people finally recognize that some long-held habits may be working against them, the instinct is often to overcorrect. Extreme diets, rigid rules, and expensive supplements feel like the logical response to fear, yet this reaction usually creates more stress than benefit. The truth is far less dramatic and far more practical. The body does not require perfection to recover some of its resilience. It responds to reduced strain, improved timing, and simple variation far more readily than most people realize. Small changes interrupt accumulation. Adjusting how often certain foods are eaten, varying preparation methods, and allowing recovery windows between repeated exposures can significantly reduce the burden placed on metabolic and vascular systems. These adjustments do not announce themselves with immediate results, but their long-term impact is profound. One of the most overlooked factors is timing. The same food can have different effects depending on when it is consumed, what it is paired with, and how frequently it appears. Spacing, rotation, and moderation matter more with age, not less. Another critical element is flexibility. Rigid routines create predictable stress. Flexible routines create adaptive strength. Introducing variety does not mean abandoning discipline, it means aligning discipline with how biology actually works. What makes these changes powerful is that they do not fight the body. They work with it. Instead of forcing outcomes, they reduce friction, allowing natural repair mechanisms to function more effectively over time. This approach rarely feels dramatic, which is why it is often overlooked. But dramatic solutions are rarely sustainable, while subtle adjustments quietly compound into meaningful protection. The goal is not to eliminate risk entirely. That is neither realistic nor necessary. The goal is to widen the margin of safety, to give the body room to adapt without being pushed to its limits every single day. When this margin exists, sudden events become less likely, and resilience becomes more visible. And yet, even with this knowledge, many people hesitate. Because understanding what to do is not the same as understanding why it feels so uncomfortable to accept. That discomfort is not accidental. Why this information feels uncomfortable. Information like this rarely fails because it is unclear or illogical. It fails because it challenges identity. When people have spent years believing they are making the right choices, questioning those choices feels less like learning and more like betrayal. Admitting that well-intentioned habits may have contributed to risk creates an internal conflict. It forces a person to reconcile effort with outcome, discipline with consequence. That tension is deeply uncomfortable, so the mind looks for relief, often by dismissing the message entirely. There's also the weight of consistency. Humans are wired to protect patterns that have worked before, even when circumstances change. A habit that once felt beneficial becomes familiar, and familiarity is often mistaken for safety. Letting go of that illusion feels like stepping into uncertainty. Social reinforcement adds another layer. When friends, family, and professionals repeat the same advice, questioning it can feel isolating. Going against the norm risks being labeled difficult, anxious, or misinformed, even when the concern is valid. Silence, once again, becomes easier. What makes this resistance particularly dangerous is that it delays action. People wait for stronger proof, clearer warnings, or undeniable symptoms, not realizing that the absence of urgency is exactly what allows problems to progress quietly. Discomfort, then, is not a sign that the information is wrong. It is often a sign that it touches something deeply rooted. Growth rarely feels reassuring in the moment it begins. Those who move past this discomfort do not do so because they are fearless. They do it because they recognize that protecting long-term health requires humility, the willingness to update beliefs as the body changes. Ignoring uncomfortable information does not preserve peace. It merely postpones reckoning. And postponement has a cost. Which leads to the final question, the one that matters more than everything that came before. What happens next is no longer about knowledge. It is about choice. What you do next matters. At this point, most people expect a prescription, a strict rule, or a definitive answer that removes uncertainty, but that expectation is part of the same thinking that created the problem in the first place. Health is not protected by absolutes. It is protected by awareness and adjustment. Nothing you have heard is meant to create fear or demand perfection. The goal was never to tell you that something is entirely good or entirely bad, but to remind you that context changes everything. The body you have today is not the body you had 20 years ago, and treating it as if it were is a quiet form of neglect. What you do next does not require radical transformation. It requires attention. Paying attention to repetition. Paying attention to signals that are easy to dismiss. Paying attention to how often habits become automatic rather than intentional. Small, thoughtful changes made consistently create more protection than dramatic overhauls that last only weeks. Reducing unnecessary strain, allowing recovery, and introducing variation give the body space to do what it has always been designed to do, adapt and preserve function. This is especially important if you are over 40, or if you care for someone who is. Prevention rarely feels urgent because its success is invisible. When it works, nothing happens. And nothing happening is the best outcome possible. Many people will watch this and move on, reassured by familiarity and routine. That choice is easy. It requires no effort and no reflection. But it also leaves everything exactly as it is. Others will pause, reconsider, and make small adjustments without needing permission or applause. Those changes may never be credited for what they prevent, but they will quietly shape the years ahead. There is no dramatic ending to this story. There is only a fork in the road. One path continues without question. The other continues with awareness. And the difference between them is rarely noticed until much later. By then, the choice has already been made.